Think about how many relationship problems are described as positive traits at first. Jealousy gets called passion. Possessiveness gets called protection. Intensity gets called chemistry. Emotional unavailability gets called mystery. It's strange when you think about it. The exact same behavior can feel romantic or alarming depending on the story attached to it. And stories are powerful, especially when attraction is involved, especially when hope is involved. We don't just observe reality, we interpret it constantly. In relationships, that interpretation becomes even stronger because relationships are built on imagination as much as observation. You don't just see a person, you see who they could become, who they might become, who you hope they become. And somewhere in that process, reality starts competing with possibility. Possibility usually wins, at least in the beginning, because possibility feels good. Reality asks harder questions. Here's something most people never realize. The moment you become emotionally invested in someone, your brain quietly changes jobs. It's no longer acting like a judge. It's acting like a lawyer. A judge asks, "What are the facts?" A lawyer asks, "How do I defend the conclusion I've already chosen?" And once we like someone, we become surprisingly skilled defense attorneys. One thoughtful text becomes evidence of who they really are. 5 disappointing actions become exceptions. A broken promise becomes an accident. A pattern becomes a misunderstanding. Not because we're irrational, because we're human. Researchers have spent decades studying something called confirmation bias, the tendency to search for evidence that supports what we already want to believe. And relationships might be where that bias becomes strongest, because attraction doesn't just create feelings, it creates investment. And investment changes perception. Have you ever noticed how forgiving you become once you want something to work? Not with everyone, just that one person, the person you keep making room for, the person you keep understanding, the person you keep explaining, even when nobody asked you to, even when they're not explaining themselves, you are for them. I used to think red flags were supposed to feel obvious, like something inside you would immediately pull away, like your instincts would know. But I don't know if that's true anymore. Because when I think about the relationships people struggle to move on from, including some of my own, the problem was rarely that something felt bad. The problem was that it felt important. Some people don't enter your life like a warning. They enter your life like a question you keep trying to answer, a text you keep rereading, a conversation you keep replaying, a person you keep thinking about long after they've left the room. And for a while, that feels meaningful until one day you realize you've spent months trying to understand someone who never spent the same energy trying to understand you. That's a strange kind of heartbreak, not dramatic, just quiet, like realizing you've been waiting for a train that was never coming. And maybe that's why these situations are so hard to leave, because you're not only attached to the person, you're attached to the possibility. And a part of you can see reality, but another part keeps saying, "Yeah, but maybe." And sometimes, if I'm honest, that word has kept people stuck longer than any red flag ever could. I think the hardest question comes later, usually long after everything falls apart, long after you've had time to think, long after you've stopped defending them. The question is, when did I know? Not when did I understand, not when did I finally admit it. When did I know? And I don't know. Maybe the answer is different for everyone, but I think most people have a moment, a small moment, a forgettable moment, a moment that didn't seem important enough at the time, a comment, a disappointment, a promise that felt slightly off, something tiny, so tiny you almost feel silly bringing it up. And that's exactly why it gets ignored, because the moment itself isn't what stays with you. The feeling does. That little pause, that little hesitation, that brief moment where something inside you goes quiet. Then you move on. Because what else are you supposed to do? End a relationship over a feeling? Walk away because you can't explain something? Most people don't. I don't think I would have either. So we stay, and we gather more evidence, more explanations, more reasons, until eventually the explanations start becoming heavier than the relationship itself. And that's a difficult thing to notice when you're living through it, because it doesn't feel like self-betrayal. It feels like patience. It feels like understanding. It feels like giving someone grace. At least that's what it feels like at first. Then one day you look back and realize how often you silenced yourself just to keep the story alive. And maybe that's the part nobody talks about enough. Sometimes the hardest thing to forgive isn't the other person. It's yourself. For how many times you talked yourself out of what you already felt. For how many times you called your intuition anxiety. How many times you called your loneliness love. How many times you convinced yourself that needing less was the same thing as asking for too much. That realization can hurt. Not because you were foolish, because you were trying to make something work, trying to be fair, trying to see the best in someone. And honestly, I think most people have done that at least once, maybe more than once, which is why hindsight feels so brutal. Not because it reveals something new, because it shows you all the moments you were standing beside yourself, quietly asking for more and never answering. Maybe that's why looking back feels so strange. Not because you discover new facts. Most of the facts were already there. What's different now is the story. At the time, you thought you were watching one version of events. Later, you realized you were watching another. And I think that's what makes certain relationships so difficult to forget. Not always because of what happened, because of what you thought was happening. The future you thought you were moving toward. The version of the relationship you thought you were building. The person you thought you were waiting for. Sometimes that's the thing that stays with us. Not the relationship itself. The story where everything eventually made sense. The story where all that patience paid off. The story where all that confusion led somewhere. And when that story falls apart, it can feel like losing something real. Because in a way, it was. You lived inside it. You made decisions inside it. You built a future around it. Maybe that's why hindsight hurts. Not because you finally see the red flags, because you finally see the difference between the relationship you had and the relationship you believed you had. And maybe that's the part nobody warns you about. Sometimes you don't miss the person. You miss the future you built around them. The one that felt so certain,